All right. But again, so really, like you ask, what's the point of it? I don't know that there is one. And it's also gotten the calls for impeachment to calm down, and also our president is being more careful, I believe, with his tone. All right, so much for that. Now, oh yes, while that the blacks were hoping for the right to become citizens, and while women were hoping to get the right to vote, the last people to have their rights recognized were the Indians.
Wow.
And why? They were looked on in a lot of ways as being even less lower than the black people. I mean, again, folk, this is the thinking of that time. Hopefully not the thinking of today. And also, unlike the blacks, they were able to take up arms against the country and fight against the country. And they did this for many generations. Eventually, they lost. But a couple of, your book names several Indians. Some of them that I do not have written down here was one named Rain in the Face. But the two that were most prominent are Red Cloud and Sitting Bull. I mentioned Red Cloud because when I joined the Guard, right here in Georgia at Fort Stewart, there's a firing range called the Red Cloud. And we went to the Red Cloud, and I did not at the time know much about who Red Cloud was, except he was Indian. He was an Indian chieftain living in the Dakotas, who was determined that they were going to hold on to lands that had been promised them. Now, I'm not going to sweep under the rug. The white man had promised it to them. And then the white man, when he found gold, wanted to renege, or found that these lands had value, wanted to renege, particularly oil. Now, this issue about the Black Hills folk is still going on in 2019. Not that you don't hear as much about it, but the issue now is not gold so much as it is oil. These Black Hills areas around there have been found to contain a whole lot of oil, so much oil that it would make us be able to tell Saudi Arabia, we don't need your oil anymore, tell all of OPEC, we don't need your oil anymore. President Obama would not allow it to be drilled for, but our next new president, I think, is going to allow it. So the issues that they raised back then are still there. The Indians claimed the land as theirs with quite a bit of justification. Sitting Bull led the very, very last Indian uprising. He was finally killed in 1890. But there occurred an event here. Hi. In the 1840s in Cadiz, Ohio, none of you have ever heard of Cadiz, don't worry about it. I've heard of it. My great-great-grandfather lived the last years of his life and died in Cadiz. At the same time, Custer lived there. But I don't know if the two people ever met each other or not. But anyway, Cadiz, Ohio, George Armstrong Custer was born. From the time he was a small boy, Custer would tell the parents, I want to be a soldier. I want to be a soldier. He wanted fame.
Armstrong was it George what?
George Armstrong Custer. Custer. Well, he was too young for the Mexican War. When the Civil War broke out, he had just gotten from West Point. At West Point, he was very brash and he broke the rules often. He would run in the halls. He would get involved in fights with his classmates. He finished in his class next to the very bottom. Right? Just one person below him. Nevertheless, the war broke out and the Army needed officers. He got to be a general pretty fast. As a general, he dressed in really, really brightly colored uniforms. Well, not colored, but he dressed in fancy uniforms. And they called him the boy general with golden curls. Nevertheless, he won a lot of his engagements, and he was the first general to defeat the Southern General Jeb Stuart. He was a cavalry general, that is, from horseback. He was the first man to send Jeb Stuart's men running through the woods. And then he pursued Jeb, but General Meade called him back. But the problem was, after the Civil War was over, he did not have the fame that would last. General Custer would be forgotten about if it wouldn't be for he finally got what he wanted, the immortal fame. Fame that will last more than 100 years after he died. Today, a lot of American schools get hurt, not because of a big victory that he won, because of a big loss he took. What he did not expect to see, the Indians could not get together more than maybe 200 or 300 men and women in a tribe, men, women, and children, a small tribe, and they're moving about, but somehow, and I don't know the details, about 2,000 Indians managed to converge together for a short time. It didn't last. If the Indians could have stayed united, but that's one of those what could have happened. But for this point in their history, about 2,000 or 3,000 Indians got together, counting men, women, and children. Custer was unaware of this. Now, and again, folk, I'll tell it the way it was. Custer went out scouting. He was looking for the young, pretty girls that he hoped to get once the battle was over. But then he got separated from the rest of his army. He split his army into 3 leaders. Benteen led one, Reno led another, and Custer led the other one. Custer was with 276 other men, 277 total, in a place called Little Bighorn, which was a little kink in the river. I believe it had the shape of a horn. It was why I got to. There was Bighorn and Little Bighorn. Anyway, the Indians surprised Custer. Now, when I was in college, I had to do a report on a battle, and one of the reports I did was where an old Indian told about when he was a kid. The Indians had a big ceremony where they were going to send these 20 Indians smack into, and these Indians who were sent knew they were going to die, but they were going to send them smack into the white army, which they did. But the idea was to confuse the army and fight and get the army to turn away from them, to fight these men who would join them, basically to mix in with the army. And they knew they were going to die, which they did. But in the meantime, they got the Custer and his men confused. Custer tried to send messenger after messenger to get help, but Mr. Benteen was afraid to move in. He knew he was outnumbered. And so did Reno. Reno would not move in. To make a long story short, Custer and all the 277 men with him were killed. The men with him were scalped. Custer was not scalped because he had married an Indian woman. So they treated him somewhat like an Indian because he had an Indian wife. But they wanted to make sure that Custer in the next life have some better understanding. So to improve his hearing, they drilled his ears with big holes, and they believed in the next life Custer would have big ears and therefore would have better understanding, particularly of the Indians, and could hear better, among other things. Wow. So this was their way. So if they didn't scalp him like they did the others, a few days later, the rest of the army, the Indians moved on. Benteen and Reno came and found them dead. There have been book after book written about this battle. There was a big congressional investigation, but General Custer finally got the immortal fame that he dreamed of, fame that would last. But it cost him his life and the lives of his men. Now, again, if he has kept his men together, folks, this is where the British made their mistake. They split their armies up and they would defeat piecemeal. If General Custer had kept his men together, they possibly could have defeated the Indians. And unfortunately for the Indians, once they'd won the battle, they got into quarrels among themselves, and they did what the Indians have always done. They scattered apart. And then the white man could beat them piecemeal. But this was one of the few victories the Indians won along the way. Custer's last stand.
He was killed along with his soldiers.
That's it? Killed all the soldiers in Custer's army, yes. Well, the battle for the Black Hills was the last in court for some 60 years. And finally, in 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the Indians' favor and declaring that the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which the Indians knew on, the Treaty of Fort Laramie had given this land to the Indians, and therefore if the land was the Indians should be able to keep it. And this supposedly, the Supreme Court can be right some of the time. This was one of those cases. But the court battle was to last for something like 60 years. The court ruled it one of the more rank, dishonorable dealings in all of our history. The Sioux Indians were not satisfied with the settlement, but they still are trying to get the Black Hills. Again, this fight is going on to this day. Now, to try to get the Indians to assimilate, Indian children were taken away from their parents and put in schools. This did not work very well, folk. I remember again when I was in college, they showed us a movie about this, how that among the Indians, something that was never known among them before came about. The Indian young men began to become juvenile delinquents. And again, juvenile delinquency was unheard of among the Indians until they were forced to try to assimilate. But they were told to forsake your old Indian ways and become what the Indians call Anglo-cized. You become like the Anglos. The Indians did a lot to resist assimilation. There were moves on to try to give the Indians farmland and say, here, farm like we white people do. Plant yourself a crop of corn, plant some potatoes, plant tomatoes, farm like we do and become one of us. The Indians did not like to take up that way of life.
It didn't like George Shima did that or what? Yeah, like potatoes and cropping it.
Yeah, for the most part though, it did not work very well. The Indians did not, the Congress passed a law that divided up reservations of parcels of land and gave this land to individual Indians as private property. And they were eligible to receive from the government 160 acres of land from reservation property. Some Indians took the allotments and became citizens, and some did not. Again, to keep speculators away, the government said that these Indians could not sell the land for 25 years, and then again, this was to discourage speculators from buying up Indian lands, which they knew would happen, because after all, the Indians hadn't paid anything for it. I kind of hate to say it because it hits me personally. A lot of times your poor people simply don't know how to handle. Give a poor person $1 million, within a year or two it'll all be gone and he'll be in worse poverty than he was before he got the million. I see at least one person nodding your head. You understand, heard this before. Lottery winners. They now have persons who win the lottery go to a special school to learn how to manage that money. Most of the time, winning the lottery will ruin and destroy your life. Now, give the Indians 160 acres, and all of a sudden, hey, we didn't pay anything for it. They'd sell it for much, much too little, much too little. So the government said, well, you can't sell it. I mean, we're going to give this land to you, but you can't sell it for 25 years. The idea was to try to get them to assimilate. But again, it's like all these government handouts. It destroys the people who receive them. There are cases where the government would give people houses and they'd use their bathtubs as coal bins to store their coal until they burned their coal. This actually was observed in many cases in the inner cities when the government gave poor people free housing or low-cost rent housing. And every house had a bathtub, every house had a shower, every house had an inside commode, whatever. What could happen? They couldn't handle it. Then, like I say, they used their bathtub as a coal bin. And again, I could tell you case after case, incident after incident. The Chinese tried helping the poor by taking money and land from the rich and redistributing the poor. Didn't work. The Chinese tried it more than once. They brought down a couple of Chinese dynasties, the Tang dynasty and the Sung dynasty. This is in the records, folks, history. The Koreans tried to redistribute land, take the land from the wealthy. In Roman times, the two brothers Gaius and Gracchus, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, wanted to do that. The Roman Senate would not let them. But take public lands and redistribute these lands to the poor. It is something that has never worked. In fact, the Dawes Act, the Dawes Allotment Act, made the Indians a lot poorer than they had been before it was passed. As one critic said, it made them the vagabonds on the face of the earth. And by the year 1890, when the last Indian war was over, and the last of the poor Indians had been caught and imprisoned or there's tribes scattered. The year was 1890. The white man had 97.5% of the land that was once been Indians. The Indians had the rest on the reservation. And one of my brothers visited an Indian reservation one time, and the reservation land was just utterly worthless as far as farmland. You could not raise livestock on it, and you could not grow crops on it. There were minerals on it, though, but again, the Indians were not miners and they were not oil drillers. One Indian said as he surrendered and handed his rifle over to a white officer, said, "I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It's cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. I'm tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Again, there was another chieftain, Geronimo, who went on to become a celebrity. Now, at one of the restaurants in Jonesboro, there is a statue. No, it's in Douglasville, Dairy Queen in Douglasville. There's a picture of Geronimo and how he became somewhat of a celebrity. But anyway, I'm not going to write that one down. The ghost dance, though. The Indians resorted to spiritual means to try to defeat the white man, and the ghost dance terrified all white people. Where the Indians got together, it was not a rain dance, but a dance where they called on their spirit gods to drive out and bring diseases and bring illness and bring bad luck on the white people. They would call on the spirits of their ancestors as well as the spirits of the ghosts of the gods of their ancestors to drive out the Indians, and it terrified a lot of white people. The book mentions places where it was tried: Idaho, Montana, Utah, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas. Several Indian tribes that tried it. It was non-violent, but it scared the whites. And especially when the Indians believed that the wearing white ghost shirts made them immune to white man's bullets. It really didn't. More and more, the Indians were defeated until eventually the few Indians who were left had their spirit broken. He'd fought a long, hard war with the white man in which he lost. And he felt like he'd been done wrong, which to a large extent he had. But folk, like I said in the first day of class, could there have been a different outcome? No. In other words, what could have been done differently? You had a group of people on two sides of the Atlantic, two sides of the Atlantic. Inevitably, the two groups were going to meet. But they were unequal in their culture, unequal in their civilization. And then one of them was just simply going to swallow the other one up. Now, you can tell me all day about the injustice of it, but what could have kept the white man out? There was no power strong enough to do that. Maybe you could make a treaty, but white settlers would violate it. If you had not gone into Indian territory, your brother would have, if you had lived back then. It's the way humanity is. Could it happen again? I don't think not only could it, but I think it will. All right, mining. Mining became a big part of the economy of the West, particularly, well, there was, of course, gold mining. We've talked about that. Gold mining, silver mining, gold and silver was discovered. Eventually, tin was discovered. Well, the most famous mine was the mine at Comstock Lode. And eventually shrewd businessmen began buying stock in the Comstock lode, particularly because the Comstock had gold and silver. But the mining led to a whole lot of outlawry, and that's became the basis for the stories of the Wild West, the outlaws of the Wild West that still existed when I was a kid in 1963 and 64. Some of them still existed, but a lot of men went west. Some of them went west to hunt for gold, others went west to steal gold from the men who found it. Pure and simply, and there were a whole lot of shootouts. The most famous shootout of all time was that occurred at OK Corral, where the three Earp brothers, Wyatt Earp and his two brothers, and Doc Holliday. Doc Holliday was from right here in Metro Atlanta. He lived in Jonesboro, and his home was still standing. But Doc Holliday Doc Holliday got on one side with some cattle rustlers on the other, and they shot it out. When it was over with, 3 of the cattle rustlers were dead. The other 2 fled. But then Wyatt Earp, by the way, went west to prospect. Prospecting, big industry, hunting for gold, digging for silver. But eventually they started digging for other minerals, including lead and tin. And of course, in more recent times, oil, but that's a subject for a later chapter. Like I say, it's been discovered that there's a whole lot of oil in the Black Hills. Now, diverse peoples. I had a girl from China some years back. You want to make sure I did not forget to mention this. In 1869, they started building the railroad, the first road, and it started in Independence, Missouri, to go all the way to California. In other words, some people wanted to go a northerly route, and some southern. Now, eventually, if you look on a map of railroads, there is a northern railroad route called the Northern Pacific. There is the middle route still. But anyway, the first railroad was the Transcontinental Railroad in 1860. It was complete in 1869. Transcontinental Railroad. It joined the east to the west. Now, they had a race to see who could get the center point of the railroad first. I forget which side won, but the race gave the men incentive to work fast and to work hard. But they laid these like 1,500 miles of track. Now, here's what this Chinese going to want me to forget. A lot of the work was done by Chinese. The Chinese made good work. The Chinese coming from China, particularly in China, where they had a huge population boom. Now, the population boom in China was brought on by the fact that the world was learning fundamental sanitation. In other words, washing your hands. The world learned that germs cause disease, but germs could be killed by cleanliness, taking baths regularly. So, to make a long story short, the Chinese couples were having as many babies as they always had, but in the former time, a Chinese couple might have 15 babies or 15 pregnancies, and only 3 or 4 of those babies actually grow up to become adults. Now they were having 15 pregnancies, and maybe 12 of them were growing up. There was Chinese couples still having as many babies as they had before, but due to better sanitation and due to the smallpox vaccination, which saved a lot of lives, China's population boomed, and a lot of these Chinese, particularly younger sons, did not have land, so a lot of them came to the Western Hemisphere. Not just the United States, but a bunch of them came to Chile and Argentina and Jamaica. You still find a lot of Chinese people in Jamaica. You find a lot of Chinese in Jamaica, and the Chinese are found in Mexico, but particularly they came to the Western United States. This was to lead to problems later. This issue of immigrants is nothing new, but the Chinese were put to work laying track for the Transcontinental Railroad, did a good job, but eventually so many of them came over that the United States decided we better pass an act to exclude them. And the Chinese Exclusion Act came along in 1882 and stopped immigration. Stopped China, and of course now this was to be a terrible blow to Chinese pride, because not only were the Chinese coming over, but also at the same time a lot of Japanese came over for the same reasons. Not enough land in Japan. And of course, Japan is much smaller. The thing about, you look on a map, China is huge, but the inhabitable part of China is not all that huge. 2/3 of China is largely uninhabited. I'm talking about Inner Mongolia, sparsely inhabited, Tibet, and Siam to the west, the western part. Most people in China live in China proper or Manchuria, southeast corner of China, and they're all bunched together in one little bunch. And well, yeah, I say little, it's because compared to the rest of China, it is little. So the Chinese found themselves very much overcrowded. Well, in the case of Japan, a lot of Japan is mountainous, but when the Japanese population started to boom, they didn't have room for all their people, so a bunch of them came in. We passed laws restricting both Chinese and Japanese immigration, yes.
So this is a true fact. I have pictures and everything to back it up. Majority of Jamaica is owned by Chinese people.
Let me tell you a personal. One of my brothers spent 2.5 years teaching school in Jamaica in the little town of Trinityville.
Yeah.
Trinityville is St. Thomas,
Yep,
Jamaica.
St. Thomas, yeah.
You've been there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's, probably you and I are the only two people in this class who've heard of it. And I went to visit him twice. And that's how come I know this about Jamaica. Jamaica is owned by the Chinese. And you see the Chinese writing, yes. And a lot of them still speak Chinese, even after being there. And the English, they can speak an English called Patois.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Patois, that's, unless you're trained in it, you won't understand it. It's easy to learn if you know English, but it's enough different from English where without training you cannot understand it. It was used by Jamaican slaves many years ago where the slaves could talk to each other without their masters understanding. You and I know this. Yeah, and I've been there. I've been there twice. I went there in August 1973 and December 1974. Yeah, stayed at the Hotel Pegasus one time. And Muhammad Ali was there at the same time. I did not see him, but he was there at the same time I was. He refused to fight in Jamaica. He said, no, Jamaica cannot support a boxer like me. In other words, I won't get enough money from Jamaica to warrant me fighting here. So he refused to fight in Jamaica. One good thing, Jamaica is the land of year-round summer, and they've managed to keep, at least when I was there, they've managed to keep a lot of tropical diseases out of it. But they're still poor, small and poor. All right, anyway, the Chinese, well, what this led to eventually, it led to a war with Japan, which we fought in the 1940s, World War II. And it led to the Chinese wound up hating us eventually, even though we sided with the Chinese in World War II. Eventually, we and China clashed, and this clash is still going on. Now, folks, I'll say this about China. I dabble in electronics a lot. I'm a ham operator, and a lot of the gadgets that I buy come from China. I can get a transistor from China for $3 that I pay $30 for here in the States. I can get an integrated circuit sometimes. Well, just right now, on the way, I've got a 50-foot long Ethernet cable that I believe I'd pay $30 for here in Walmart, any Walmart. I'm getting it for $5. So I do the business with them, and all that, but I wonder how much longer this will last. Now, right now, the issue of trade with China is a big issue. And one reason the Chinese can put out the products so cheap is they're using very, very cheap labor. All right, I'll leave that, but that's contemporary. Most of your Chinese who came to America lived in California, but particularly, well, here's what we did, folk. In 1870, we passed a law. The law had been before that only whites could become citizens. Then after the Civil War passed a law that included blacks. So now we have whites becoming citizens and blacks, but guess who's excluded? American Indians and Chinese. We're still excluded from becoming citizens. And again, this was eventually helped lead to a conflict with China. Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Now, something that I did not mention, but something that happened during the administration of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln passed the law, the Homestead Act.
Am I
How many,
And that
160
did
acres?
What's that?
They guaranteed 160 acres? You ever read that?
The Homestead Act, I'm on page
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
446.
I believe when they went from 40 to 160 acres. You see that? You see where it says right here, where it says.
Now this is now this is white people here. This homestead is for white people.
Okay.
Yeah, what you're talking about is for American Indians, but in 1862, now this is, don't get confused. Sherman promised Indians 40 acres and a mule,
Right.
which was not